There are stories the world never pauses to notice. Stories that begin in silence and desperation, where one child is lost before he is ever truly known, and another is fighting to live in a house too large for grief to fill. And this is one of them. The story of a maid who had milk but no baby, and a duke who had a baby but no way to keep him alive. And the moment their lives collided in a way neither of them would ever undo. Mara Bell did not cry when her son died. That was what unsettled people most, if anyone had been there to see it. But there hadn't been. Not really. Just a midwife with tired hands and careful words, and a small rented room that smelled faintly of soap and old wood, and a silence so complete it felt like something physical pressing against her ribs, because grief like hers did not arrive with spectacle or sound. It came quietly, slipping into the body before the mind could understand, settling into the spaces where hope had been and making itself at home there. And the cruelest part, the part no one warned you about, was not the loss itself but what came after. The way her body continued as though nothing had happened, as though the world had not shifted irrevocably. The milk coming in steady and warm, insistent in its purpose. A promise her body kept for a child who would never answer it. And she lay there in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, one hand resting over herself as if she could will it to stop, as if she could tell her own body the truth it refused to hear, that there was no baby, that there would be no crying in the night, no small weight placed in her arms, no future unfolding one fragile moment at a time. But the body does not listen to grief. It listens to time, to instinct, to ancient rhythms that do not pause for heartbreak. And so it went on, and so did she, in the way people sometimes do when stopping feels like it might break something beyond repair. Far from her small room, in a place where the floors gleamed and the walls held centuries of quiet wealth, Duke Adrian Hale stood in a nursery that felt increasingly like a battlefield he was losing, his son in his arms screaming with a ferocity that seemed impossible for something so small, a sound that cut through the house and settled into his bones, and he did not know what to do with it, because this helplessness was not something he had been trained for, not something he could command into submission or reason away. He had faced men across negotiation tables and watched them fold under pressure, had led soldiers into situations where the outcome had been uncertain but never entirely out of his control. And yet here he was, undone by a child no larger than his forearm, a child who would not eat, who turned away from every attempt to feed him as though rejecting the world itself. And the wet nurses, 4 of them, carefully selected, experienced, capable, had all failed, one after another, leaving behind a trail of polite apologies and quiet concern that grew heavier with each passing day. And the house had begun to feel it, that subtle shift in atmosphere when something is wrong in a way no one can fix, the servants moving more quietly, the conversations shorter, the glances more frequent, because everyone understood what was at stake even if no one dared to say it aloud. The heir to the estate, the continuation of a name that had outlived generations, was slipping through their fingers, and the Duke, for all his power, could do nothing but stand there and listen to his son cry. The letter that would change everything arrived without ceremony, folded simply, carried by a man who did not know its weight, addressed in a hand that Mara recognized immediately. The midwife who had stayed when there had been nothing left to do, who had spoken gently but never falsely. And Mara almost did not open it, because opening it meant engaging with a world she had been avoiding, a world that expected movement, decisions, continuation. But eventually she did, because there are only so many hours you can sit in stillness before even grief begins to demand something different. And the words inside were direct, practical, almost blunt in their urgency. There is a child, 3 weeks old, his mother dead. He will not feed. He is failing. I told them I knew someone. And Mara read it once, then again, slower the second time, as though the meaning might change if she gave it enough attention, as though the weight of it might lessen. But it did not. It settled instead, deep and undeniable, because it asked something of her she was not sure she could give, not physically. That part was painfully possible. But something else, something harder to name, to take what her body had prepared for her own child and offer it to another, to step into a space that was not hers and become necessary there. And she sat with that for a long time, the room quiet around her, the absence of her son filling every corner. And in the end, the decision was not as complicated as it seemed, because staying where she was had already become impossible, because doing nothing felt like a different kind of loss. And so she stood, slowly at first, as though testing whether the world would allow it, and began to gather what little she had, her movements deliberate, practical, the way they had always been, because if she thought too much about what she was doing she might stop, and stopping was no longer an option. The journey took most of a day, long enough for doubt to settle in and then be pushed aside by necessity, long enough for her to consider turning back and then recognize that there was nothing behind her to return to. And when she arrived, the manor rose before her larger than anything she had ever entered, imposing in a way that might have intimidated her once, but did not now, because grief had stripped away certain fears, had made others irrelevant, and she was led through the servants' entrance, through corridors that smelled faintly of polish and something older, something embedded in the walls, until she heard it, the crying, sharp and relentless, cutting through everything else. And she did not wait for instruction after that, did not ask permission. She followed the sound to its source and found him there, the Duke, standing in the center of the room holding a child who seemed too small to produce such force, his posture rigid, controlled in a way that suggested control was the only thing keeping him upright. And he looked at her when she entered, really looked, as though trying to assess in a single moment whether she might succeed where others had failed. And she did not waste time on introductions or formalities, because there are moments when those things do not matter, when only the immediate need remains. And she held out her arms, steady, certain, and said quietly, "He's hungry." And for a brief second he hesitated, caught between instinct and propriety, between trust and the fear of making the wrong choice again. But desperation has a way of cutting through hesitation, and he stepped forward, placing the child in her arms with a care that bordered on reverence. And the crying did not stop immediately. Of course it did not. But it changed, softened at the edges, shifted from fury to something more uncertain, more hopeful. And Mara held him close, her body responding before her mind could intervene, before she could think about what it meant. And in that moment, in that quiet, fragile shift, something began, not healing, not yet, but something like the possibility of it, something neither of them had expected, and neither of them could afford to ignore. The child who had once refused the world began, slowly, to accept it. And with that fragile change, the house of Duke Adrian Hale seemed to exhale for the first time in weeks, not with relief exactly, but with the cautious easing of something that had been held too tightly for too long. And at the center of it all was Mara Bell, who did not try to change anything, and yet changed everything simply by doing what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less. The mornings came early, and more often than not she found the Duke already outside the nursery, fully dressed, composed in that careful way that suggested sleep had become optional, and they would enter together in silence, not out of awkwardness, but because words felt unnecessary when the purpose was clear. And over time a quiet rhythm formed, the child waking, Mara tending, the Duke watching, at first from a distance, then closer, then not at all, pretending he did not want to be part of it. Henry grew stronger, his cries softening, his small body filling out, and with each passing day the fear that had gripped the household loosened its hold, though it never entirely disappeared, and the Duke changed with it, subtly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid control in him giving way to something more uncertain but more human. And Mara noticed, of course she did, the way his hands steadied when he held his son, the way he lingered longer than necessary, the way he listened as though learning something he had never been taught. One morning she arrived to find him already holding the child, and this time there was no panic in it, only care, awkward still, but real, and the child did not cry, simply rested against him as though the world, for once, made sense. And Mara paused in the doorway, watching, something quiet and unspoken settling in her chest before she stepped forward and made her presence known. And he looked up, something unguarded crossing his face before it faded, though not completely, not the way it used to. And he handed the child to her with a familiarity that had not existed before. "He slept," he said quietly, as though testing the truth of it, and she nodded. He did, and that was enough. It was in the afternoons, when the house fell into that soft, temporary stillness, that something else began to take shape, something neither of them acknowledged but both felt, and it showed itself most clearly in the library, where Mara went seeking nothing more than quiet and found the Duke already there. And when he saw her, he did not question her presence, did not dismiss it. He simply said, "You may stay." And so she did, sitting by the window with a book she'd barely read while he worked at his desk, and for a long time they existed in that shared silence, not empty but settled, the kind of silence that does not ask anything of you. And in that space Mara realized, with a quiet kind of surprise, that she was no longer just enduring her days, she was living them again, in small, careful ways, without the constant weight of pretending she was untouched by loss. And that realization felt dangerous, because belonging, even in something this fragile, had already cost her once. When he finally spoke, it was without looking at her, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "You make it seem simple," he said, and she turned a page she had not read. "It isn't," she replied. "It's just necessary." And the words lingered between them, unchallenged, settling into the space they shared. And in that moment, something shifted. Not enough to name, not enough to understand, but enough that the distance between them no longer felt fixed, and both of them, whether they admitted it or not, began to sense that what had started as survival was slowly becoming something more. The change, when it came, did not arrive gently. It came in the form of expectation, dressed in silk and certainty, as the world beyond the nursery finally asserted itself, reminding them both that what they had built in quiet corners of the house was never meant to last. And Marabelle understood this long before anyone said it aloud, because she had always understood the difference between what is needed and what is allowed. The child no longer depended on her the way he once had. He laughed now, reached for things, for people, and sometimes for her, which made it harder than she had prepared for, because she had told herself from the beginning that this was temporary, that she would give what she could and leave before it became something she could not walk away from. But the leaving, when it came, was not simple. The Duke had been told, firmly, repeatedly, what was expected of him: a proper marriage, a suitable mother for his heir, a return to order that made sense to everyone except the man who was meant to live it. And he tried, at first, to believe in that version of his life, to step back into the shape that had always been waiting for him. But something no longer fit the way it once had. Something had shifted in the quiet hours he had spent watching his son breathe, in the unguarded conversations he had not meant to have, in the presence of a woman who had never asked anything of him, and yet had changed everything simply by being there. Mara did not wait to be dismissed. She packed her things before anyone could ask her to, because dignity, once lost, is rarely returned, and she had already given too much of herself to risk losing the rest. And when she went to say goodbye, she did not allow herself to linger, did not allow the moment to become something it could not survive. But the child reached for her, small, certain, unaware of consequence, and for a second, just a second, everything in her faltered. The Duke saw it, felt it, the quiet breaking point neither of them had acknowledged, and for the first time, he did not choose what was expected. "Stay," he said, not as a command, not as a plea, but as a decision finally spoken aloud, and the word hung between them, fragile and impossible and entirely real, because it was not just about her, or the child, or even the life they might build. It was about choosing something honest over something acceptable, something uncertain over something already decided. And Mara, who had spent her life surviving what the world allowed her, stood there in the space between leaving and staying, and realized that this, too, was a kind of risk, but not all risks end in loss. In the end, the story does not resolve with certainty or perfection, because lives like theirs rarely do, but with something quieter, something more enduring, the understanding that grief had not only taken from them, it had also led them here, to a moment where they could choose differently, and whether they built a life together or simply carried the mark of what they had been to each other, one truth remained unchanged. The child who had once been starving was no longer alone, and neither were they.